So this is entitled NASA Thinking. I just wanted to kind of cover a little bit of stuff that we've done in the past related to this issue, and then of course looking forward to how we might attack the asteroid and the challenges we tend to face. So let's use this kind of outline. Let's go back in time a little bit and just talk about rendezvous and docking. Docking is kind of another word for capture, usually with collaborative objects. We'll talk about the orbital debris problem. I want to make one particular point associated with that, and that's around the technology development for that orbital debris. And then we'll talk a longer period of time on satellite servicing experiences and what those experiences have done to help us think about how we can utilize both natural and artificial space assets. And finally, we'll end up just introducing the asteroid redirect mission, and then we're going to be talking later on more about that. So just go back in time for a little bit. This is about 50 years or so back in time. John Hobalt, Langley employee, who came across the idea of doing a lunar orbit rendezvous to land a man on the moon instead of Earth orbit rendezvous. And it's very controversial. But he showed that with a single Saturn V launch, you could actually do a round-trip human mission if you did lunar orbit rendezvous. And this is 1961 to 62. He finally convinced headquarters that, yeah, we can do rendezvous around the moon. So the question is, when did we first demonstrate rendezvous with any two satellites? Well, it was attempted in 1965, 3 years later in Earth orbit with Jim McDivitt and Gemini 4. And he did what any of us naturally would do. He lined up his vehicle with a target vehicle, maybe 30 or so meters from him, aimed the active vehicle, and accelerated his vehicle towards the passive vehicle. Anybody got an idea what happened? You changed altitude, right? You not only change your speed, but you change your orbit. And so simply pointing the active vehicle's nose at the target and thrusting didn't work. The crew, like everyone else at MSC, the Manned Space Flight Center, now we know as JSC, just didn't understand or reason out the orbital mechanics involved. But when you think about it, it's very obvious. But when you're in space doing it, it's not maybe quite as obvious. So again, in 1965, December, Wally Schirra maneuvered his Gemini 6 spacecraft with a target Gemini 7 spacecraft within about a foot. They didn't have docking capability, but he proved that you could rendezvous with another spacecraft. And soon after that, Gemini 8, March of 1966, actually demonstrated both rendezvous and docking on the Gemini 8. So look at this time frame. 62, John Hobalt sold the idea that we could do this around the moon, and we hadn't demonstrated it yet around the Earth until 4 years later. So picking the architecture before you actually do the mission, all the pieces are known, is kind of what we're doing here. We're saying we're going to go do an asteroid redirect mission. Well, we don't know how to capture it yet. And so we're kind of asking for your help today to think about how to do this. So this isn't unprecedented in terms of deciding on an architecture and then developing the technology to do it. Let's talk about orbital debris a minute. Everybody thinks about in terms of one of the big issues with space exploration, particularly in low Earth orbit, is the orbital debris problem. If we never launch another satellite, this problem just gets worse, because eventually there are collisions of satellites that take one large object and make many small objects out of it. And so mitigation and remediation of orbital debris is an important problem, not just for NASA, but for anybody, commercial space as well as DoD, who wants to operate in low Earth orbit in particular. And so there's a whole activity associated with space situational awareness, detect, tracking, identifying, threat warnings and assessments. All sorts of data is gathered here. And last November, the Pentagon approved something they call the Space Fence Plan. which is not actually putting up a fence like we think of it, stopping asteroids from passing through the fence, but essentially measuring every object that passes through that imaginary fence so that you can really better track and characterize these objects. This isn't a new problem. It's been going on for some time. And in fact, NASA's had a orbital debris program office at Johnson Space Center for quite some time. So you can go to the website and find out information on modeling, measurements, protection, mitigation, remediation, and reentry of these objects. A lot of good data here. But you may ask the question, why don't we already have remediation capabilities to go remove orbital debris, and why aren't we solving this problem now? And it's not just a technical issue, it's also a legal issue. There's a space policy issue associated with touching other people's, other countries' hardware in space. So there are both legal and other kinds of issues that make this difficult. I wanted to point out that in terms of orbital debris remediation, and you might think of that as one of the applications of the capture devices that you develop, there are some agency guidelines that are about to be released that say we can do technology development, particularly at the kind of lower TRL levels, but we are not to develop an operational system. As I said, space policy prevents us from doing that right now. That might change in the future when this problem gets a little bit worse, but also if you're going to do some space debris remediation activities, they have to be coordinated through the Space Technology Mission Directorate. But the official guidelines will be coming up fairly shortly. So let's talk about these artificial space objects. I mean, we created a bunch of them, right, in a National Space Station. So we've got quite a bit of experience in building something that as complex as this, weighing over 400 tons, using it piece by piece with shuttle flights and robotic arms, piece by piece, assembling the trusses, assembling the rays, and putting together this football-sized vehicle that, of course, we have orbiting today. So ISS assembly and satellite servicing is the second thing I wanted to mention. We do have quite a bit of experience with satellite servicing, actually. It kind of first started out back in 1992 when one of the commercial satellites, Intelsat 603, its perigee motor failed. And so this is a geosynchronous communication satellite, and it was stuck in low Earth orbit, essentially worthless to anybody. Another piece of stage 3. But on STS-49, the shuttle mission that was designated to go retrieve the satellite, capture it, if you will, and then attach a perigee motor to actually boost it up into the correct orbit, up into geosynchronous orbit. So we've talked, the title of this kind of forum is a non-cooperative target. Well, this was a cooperative target. It was this satellite here, the reaction wheels worked, and so they were able to null all the rates. And the idea was on the end of the shuttle's robotic arm, there was a capture bar that was to rendezvous with the satellite, latch on, and then bring it into the bay. Well, they tried on, I think it was May 10th of '92, and couldn't grasp it. Somehow the capture bar wasn't mating properly with the satellite. And so they came back, pulled everybody back in, thought about it a day, and so May 11th they went out again, having convinced themselves, well, maybe we weren't pushing hard enough, that maybe there's some thermal mismatch or something, and so if we just push a little harder, maybe we can capture this satellite. Well, it turns out that they tried that and actually inserted some rates, some tumbles into the vehicle. So these torques and forces they were putting on the vehicle actually made it tumble so much it became fairly dangerous. And they had to back off. And so then they scratched their heads. And so on the 13th, 2 days later, they deployed for the first time 3 crew members to go out and capture the satellite by hand. So it was tumbling, you remember, on the 11th. Well, again, the ground control system was used, ground operations was used to stabilize the satellite with the reaction wheels. They got it back into a fixed, stable, passive target again. And this time the 3 astronauts reached out and just grabbed it and pulled it into the cargo bay. So It shows you that a cooperative target might become uncooperative, you know, as in this case. And so you can almost think of it the way that you shake hands with somebody. Typically, you put one person puts their hand out and the other person grabs that still hand. You kind of don't both do this number. It's the same idea. You want a passive target to kind of reach towards. That's kind of what we're used to doing. The asteroid capture doesn't give us that luxury. So that's the challenge, one of the challenges we face. Satellite servicing continued. Hubble Space Telescope was one of the very few satellites that was developed for servicing in space. So it was made so that you could service it. Of course, it was launched in 1990, but the primary optics had a flaw. And so the very first mission that was launched in 93 was to go add some corrective optics so that you could do deep field, long duration measurements. In 1997, also, there was a servicing mission. One of the problems that they were having on their array, and I see Lucas Horta here, was there was a jitter problem with the solar arrays. The Hubble Space Telescope is supposed to point to within 7 milliarc seconds to get these real stable images that we all like to see. Well, these solar arrays that were first deployed on the vehicle had a stick-slip problem, a thermally induced one, and so all during their orbit it would release energy and violate this pointing requirement. So they were replaced. In 99 and 2002, you see some additional servicing missions, gyros, some updated instruments, and you see a fairly long hiatus here between 2002 and 2009, the last servicing mission, which was really post-Columbia. So when Columbia accident occurred, it was decided that we weren't going to use people to do satellite servicing anymore, and we're also going to make sure that people could get back to the space station as a safe harbor. Well, to fly to the Hubble Space Telescope, it put you in an orbit where you could not get back to the station. And so there was a real concerted effort undertaken by a lot of people within NASA to try to do this last servicing mission totally robotically, with no humans. And so that led to the development of robotic servicing technology that's underway today and is facilitating some of the work we'll be doing with the asteroid capture. And so let's talk about one part of that, and that's the Satellite Servicing's Capabilities Office. Suresh already mentioned at Goddard Space Flight Center, there's a team there that are developing tools and various mission architectures to go do satellite servicing. It's a fairly large team, about 30 to 40 people. That is being relied on quite heavily. In addition to servicing, one of the particular aspects of servicing that they want to look at is refueling spacecraft. A lot of the spacecraft that we deploy are just simply run out of fuel. They're fully functional, but no longer can maintain station. And so on the last mission of the shuttle, the Atlantis, in 2011, they carried a device on there to mount to the International Space Station, where in a subsequent mission that's to be flown, they will actually dock with that vehicle and transfer propellant. So satellite servicing, and particularly refueling, is really critical. Just to give you an idea, particularly in geosynchronous, geosatellites are retired, 25 are retired each year, and simply because 10 of them are simply because they're out of fuel. So adding fuel is a really important aspect. Manned geoservicing study. NASA and DARPA see the value of looking at how do we do servicing in geo. The intelligence community has a lot of assets in geo, as does the communications industry. And we looked at what it takes to put humans in geo to do this type of servicing. Of course, radiation is a big part of that problem. So that activity was undertaken. A study report is available for you on that topic. And in fact, DARPA has gone on and taken that program a bit farther, and they have a program called Phoenix, which is looking at, again, developing advanced geospace robotics for servicing. Also looking at something they call SATLETs, kind of a fractionated spacecraft design, kind of like CubeSats, but a little bit different, and then how to launch those devices. Again, that program you can take a look at. So let me wind up here by talking about, quickly, the asteroid strategy. So in 2010, the President announced that we would have a human mission to an asteroid. And since then, we've been working on that. In 2014, the current year that we're in, we're looking at how this mission will unfold. and that's why we're here today to talk about this one technology of capture. The idea is to redirect a 7 to 10 meter diameter asteroid to a stable orbit in translunar space. And then once you've done that, then you launch a human mission to go to that asteroid and explore it and perhaps mine it for ISRU. So this activity is kind of 3 phases. You got to identify the asteroids, then you got to go redirect them, and then you go explore them. And so the first phase is kind of come out in terms of a grand challenge on how to identify these asteroids. One of the contests is called the Asteroid Data Hunter, really oriented towards how can we look at these faint images that we have now and increase the detection sensitivity and imperfections in the data to get much better resolution images from the data that we have currently from telescopes. So let me just finally wrap up saying that space rendezvous, docking, proximity operations, we've been doing this for 50 years, both robotic and human-assisted missions. NASA's experience in robotic surfacing of the Hubble Space Telescope, particularly after Columbia, accelerated interest in satellite surfacing, particularly for the geosystems. And of course, NASA, industry, and DARPA are all interested in this, human and robotic only. And finally, as we're looking forward today in the next talks, the challenges that I see are one, it's a non-cooperative target. There's an uncertainty in the size and the angular rates. We have a very large 30 to 50 kilowatt solar electric propulsion system, so very large solar arrays that are flexible that we have to be concerned about. And of course, the deep space robotic operations, the capture, the dynamics, and the controls of those vehicles. Thanks.